Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new session of our webinar series, the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series, a partnership between IIQM at the University of Alberta, ATLAS.ti, and the University of Georgia. So thank you all of you for being here. Today we have Dr. Karin Olson from the University of Alberta, Faculty of Nursing, giving a presentation named or titled An Introduction to Grounded Theory. I'm Ricardo Contreras with ATLAS.ti, and let me first say a few introductory words about the technology. We are going to have all of your microphones muted in order to avoid echo and background noise. However, if you have questions while Dr. Olson is speaking, please feel free to write down your questions in a section in the GoToWebinar control panel named Questions. And you can practice now. You can write something like hi, and I will be able to read that. So at the end of Dr. Olson's presentation, about 40 minutes or so, I am going to proceed to read those questions out loud, and Dr. Olson will proceed to answer them, okay? And in some cases, I'm going to offer the microphone so that you can speak out loud. So another thing before we introduce the presenter is that I would like to say that this webinar is being recorded, and you are going to get the video of it about 3 hours after the presentation is over. So with that, I would like to ask my colleague from IIQM, Julianna Barrabas, to introduce today's presenter.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, as always, for your ongoing support through ATLAS of this webinar series. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Karin Olson this morning. She is the Interim Coordinator of the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology at the University of Alberta, a registered nurse and a professor in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta. She teaches both an introductory and an advanced course in qualitative research approaches. Dr. Olson is interested in using qualitative research approaches to develop theory with a primary focus on ethnography and grounded theory. She's currently conducting a large ethnographic study of shared decision-making in community-based settings in Alberta, but has also conducted many qualitative studies in symptom management, primarily in advanced cancer. Dr. Olson has published many articles documenting her research findings, as well as a book on interviewing, Essentials of Qualitative Interviewing, and an edited volume on using evidence from qualitative studies, Qualitative Health Research as Evidence. Please help me welcome Dr. Karin Olson.
Thank you very much, Juliana. I will now give you the control of the session, Dr. Olson, so that you can proceed with your presentation.
Okay. Let's see, I'm looking for the share my screen link.
It should come up any second.
Okay. Show screen. Yes, there we are.
All right. Now it's all in your hands. Maybe I should add that at the end of the presentation, just leave the last slide open so that if you need to make reference to earlier slides, you can do that easily.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. So now it's all in your hands.
Okay. Well, many thanks to ATLAS and to Julianna for the kind introduction. And thank you for joining our presentation today. I would like to share what I've learned, I guess I would say, about grounded theory over the years. As many of you know, research designs are constantly evolving, and they don't always evolve in the same direction, depending on who you talk to. So if you disagree with anything I say, based on your experience and the things you've read, please don't hesitate to say so. So here's a brief overview of what I'd like to do in the next 40 minutes or so. I have some background comments. Then I want to talk about the theoretical foundations of grounded theory and how you can go about choosing the best grounded theory approach for the study that you plan to do. Then I want to talk about the research process a little bit, and I have a hypothetical interview, a segment of one that I've coded, so we can talk about the coding process and how coding ends up helping you to build theory. So I've used one of my own papers to illustrate that. And the last thing I want to talk about is overcoming some of the practical problems that we face in grounded theory. So first of all, some definitions. So you can see here the basic definitions that I'm going to be using. And I'm going to treat grounded theory as a design. I don't use the word methodology unless I'm talking about the study of research methods. So if we could try to use this common set of terms today, that would help me understand your questions in more detail. So I'd like to start by looking at the theoretical underpinnings here. You know, down the left-hand side, you see the standard components of any paradigm, whether quantitative or qualitative. And then in the next two columns, what I've tried to do is compare quantitative and qualitative paradigms. Now, if Glaser were joining us on this webinar today, he would be very clear that he has an objectivist epistemology. Over time, the epistemological positions of the various schools within grounded theory have shifted. And that's a really interesting thing that I'd like to talk about in some more detail. In the third row, you can see I've got methodology there. That's simply because the standard textbooks on design and paradigms use that language. But what I'm really talking about here is design. So the quantitative approach, we're trying to control extraneous influences, whereas on the qualitative side, of course, we want those extraneous influences. In fact, we deliberately sample to get the full range, as near as we know, of people within a particular context who might have something important to tell us. You can see that I've added an additional row at the bottom that says worldview. So here, what I'm talking about is the fact that who you are as a person, how you grew up, and the things that you've read, particularly as you've entered graduate school and beyond, shape the kind of questions you ask. So I'm a nurse. I ask questions. Most of my questions are related to nursing practice, although more recently some are more related to health system delivery. But I grew up in a particular kind of environment as a child. I was very curious, and that was encouraged. So questions were welcome. That's not everyone's experience. And I've read certain authors that have really influenced how I see my nursing practice. So because there are some core readings that we all do in nursing and in graduate school, or within any particular discipline, there are core readings. Those will shape the kinds of questions that you ask. My point here is that worldview is important in both paradigms. But on the qualitative side, when we're doing any study, we begin by making that worldview explicit. So I'm a nurse. I'm interested in this question because It comes from my clinical practice. So most of my questions relate to cancer nursing. I spent 10 years as the coordinator of nursing research at the Cancer Institute here in Edmonton. So I had a chance to see really interesting things up close that are relevant in cancer nursing. Would they apply in obstetrics or in cardiology or other areas of practice? I don't know. I haven't worked there. But if I don't make that explicit, people don't understand where I'm coming from and why I've chosen to approach my research question as I have. So now let's talk about the development of grounded theory. So the objective here is to create a theory that is based on data rather than on some idea, theoretical idea that you bring to the study. Now, remember that Glaser comes from sociology, and I'm guessing that there are maybe some sociology students on this webinar. One of the advantages that sociology students have is that they have a very deep grounding in theory. So Glaser didn't say that you should ignore that. In fact, I would argue you can't. You've already read it. You're already thinking about it. But what he means is that you don't decide on a theoretical framework before you've actually done the study. You do the study first. You create at least a conceptual model, and then you start to think of the theories that are out there, where does my work fit? So you do your work first. You don't start with a conceptual framework. So why is that important? It's important because if you start with a framework, all you know is whether your theory fits that framework. You would run the risk of missing any new and novel ideas. So for those of you who are PhD students, you know you get a PhD because you discovered something, right? If all you can say is my work is like everyone else's, you don't get a PhD for that. So it's really, really important that you understand that the purpose of grounded theory is to build a theory from scratch using an inductive process, and then create or examine potential links to other theories after the fact. So what theory informed the development of grounded theory? Here I've given you some of the basic theoretical foundations for grounded theory. So you can see that the interest of Glaser and Strauss when they were developing grounded theory was to learn more about how meaning arrives, how we derive meaning based on our interactions with other people. Where does that meaning come from? And we typically use interviews as one primary data collection source. Why? We use interviews because language is the primary symbol system in worldwide. So it is the way that social life is expressed. So if we hear carefully what people say, and we ask them to clarify that until we feel we understand, we have the best chance of understanding how meaning comes about through social interaction for them. So you know probably that Glaser and Strauss were the developers of grounded theory. Their work was originally published in about 1967. Glaser, to this day, has an objectivist epistemology. I keep asking him, I have not recently, but in times past, what he thought about the move to a constructivist approach, and he doesn't think that's useful for getting at the kinds of things he was hoping to find with grounded theory. So we could have a discussion about that later on if you like. But Glaser's idea is that if you begin with a problem in daily life and you collect data using observations, interviews, and so forth, you begin to identify these things which we call codes. We group those codes, the similar ones, together and gradually move up to a concept. So those codes used to talk about them as indicators of the concept. So what is the concept that this code points at? And when we get to the interview that I've already coded a little bit, we can talk about this more. So Glaser had an objectivist ontology. He believed that reality existed, but he was interested in understanding the emic perspective, that is, the insider's perspective of that reality, using an inductive approach. So you know that Strauss and Corwin continued the development of grounded theory. They took it in a little bit of a different direction. They shifted their ontology to a relativist position. Initially, an objectivist on epistemology, but in talking with Dr. Corwin more recently, she thinks that a constructivist approach is more accurate in terms of what actually happens. I'm going to just skip over this slide. What I've tried to do is highlight what some of the differences were between Glaser on the one hand and Strauss and Corwin on the other side, because they had a fairly significant fallout, or parting of the ways, I guess I would say. Glaser thought that Strauss and Corwin's work was too prescriptive. Strauss and Corwin thought that Glaser's work didn't provide enough direction about how to do it, how to do grounded theory, and I'm sure there are many different positions there amongst those of you on this webinar. So, sorry?
Yes, Karin, may I interrupt for a second? I have received several messages from people saying that they cannot hear. So I need to make sure before you continue that people can hear everything, okay? So okay. I will ask everybody, if you can hear me, I'm sorry, well, me as well as Dr. Olson, please click on the hand icon on the control panel next to your name. And okay, perfect. So everything seems to be okay. Those of you who click on the hand icon, click on it again, and that will lower your hand, okay? So those of you who have problems hearing, please check your audio settings. And I'm sorry to having interrupted you, but now please go ahead.
Okay. Is this better?
All is okay. All is okay.
Okay. So Lenny Schatzman was another important figure in the development of grounded theory. There are very few articles written by him, though, and so it's hard to really understand his work. But his primary interest was in the interactions between people and how we could use those to develop theory. And but when you read his work, he doesn't quite take it through to a theory. He ends with a detailed description that reads much more like an ethnographic result. So now we come to Kathy Sharma. So Kathy Sharma was the person who really put the constructivist perspective on the radar. And so So she does her grounded theory process the same as all others. But her idea, the main issue here, is that her idea is that the researcher and the participant co-construct the data. So that means that if a particular study was done by somebody who was a psychologist, they would get slightly different results than I would, because I approach the data as a nurse. And that's why it's really, really important to make sure that you identify who you are and where you come from at the beginning of a study, particularly if you're going to use a constructivist grounded theory approach. So relativist ontology, the process is exactly the same as outlined by Glaser in terms of how you build up the concepts, but the epistemology is different. Now, the last person I'd like to talk about is Clark. Clark's work is very similar to Sharma's, but her idea was that researcher-participant dyad is actually influenced by a larger environmental context. So she developed a system for mapping those influences onto the dyad so that one could make the influence more explicit. So I've shown on the bottom of the slide here the different kinds of maps she made. And if this interests you, if this is the kind of work you want to do, it's really useful to get her book on situational analysis. So how do you choose which one of these? Some people will tell you, Glaser, for example, will tell you that Sharma's approach is wrong. I take a slightly different approach. My approach is that you have to choose the school that is consistent with the ontology and epistemology of your research question. So I think when I teach this content, we go through an exercise of laying out what the ontology and epistemology of each question might be, how you would change the question around if you wanted to have a constructivist approach. I'll suggest to you that you could play with that a little bit yourself. I think it's really fascinating. It used to be that people said that you should choose the approach that fit with your personal ontology and epistemology. I think that's really dangerous. You do not want, I don't think, to get tied down to any particular ontology and epistemology. Because then what happens if a research question arrives in your clinical practice that requires a different ontology? I actually do randomized control trials sometimes. We do structural equation modeling. The point is you have to be free to do the work that your question demands. And that's why it's important to think really hard about what the ontology and epistemology of your question are. So somebody was saying to me, well, what about feminist grounded theory or critical grounded theory? We could talk about that in some detail, but you see that, I would say that's where worldview comes in. If you've read a lot of critical social theory, that's your lens. You say, I arrived at this question because I really was influenced by so-and-so who read extensively in critical social theory, or a feminist author, or post-colonial author. Those are all parts of your worldview. So the research process, what does the research process look like? We start out with something called purposive sampling. That means you look for people who are likely to have firsthand knowledge of the thing that you're studying. So I'm interested in cancer patients, so that's who I recruit. As my theory becomes more apparent, we see holes in our theory. We see, oh, I haven't talked to anybody that could inform this part of my theory. So now we switch to something called theoretical sampling. That's where we go out late in the study to find people who might know about some particular aspect of the theory that we're trying to develop. Second thing, data collection and analysis occur simultaneously. So the idea is you interview, you get it transcribed, and you analyze that one. You keep going. This way you're more efficient. You don't wait until you have, say, 10, 12 interviews before you start coding. Because every interview informs slightly the questions that you're going to ask, and you might want to shift your questions a little bit depending on what you're learning. So you might hear of theoretical axial coding, open, focus, selective coding. These are all just coding styles, basically the same in my view, but the main feature is constant comparison. So when you code the second or third interview in, you have to go back to your earlier interviews and see if you were finding similar ideas. This is how you start to build an understanding of whether your categories or the core ideas are becoming saturated. Are you just hearing the same thing over and over again in every interview, or are you starting to hear something different? If you are, you might have to have a second interview with some of those early people and say, here's an idea that's come up in my later interviews. I want to know if this has been your experience as well. So we go back and forth between our participants, and that is why when you write your consent form, make sure you ask for 2 to 3 interviews so that you have the opportunity to go back if you want to do that. Once you start coding and building up your categories, you'll see that you have many categories, but in some of them you have lots of data, and other ones you don't have very much data. So at this point, typically what happens in grounded theory is we say we're just going to focus on the one that has a lot of data in it. We call that our core category. And then we start to explore the codes in the core category in more detail and build up what is called a basic social process or a social psychological process. And that process answers the research question. So I've talked about using interviews, primarily interviews, but you can use observational data. The results begin as description, but they finish with theory. So if I'm one of the editors for QHR, Qualitative Health Research, if you sent me an article and you said you used grounded theory, but all you had was description, I'd send it back to you and I'd say, good start, but I need to see the theory development. So as I said before, I work mostly in cancer care. Here in the next 2 slides, I've coded a hypothetical, a section of a hypothetical interview that I made up by putting data from a bunch of interviews together. So for those of you in academic positions, this is just a little thing to remember. When you write a consent form, add a separate section where you say, may I have permission to keep your data for teaching purposes? So people are very happy to do this, generally speaking. So I have permission from my participants to use the data this way. Now, in this case, the colors, I've used different colors just to show how many different when one code leaves off and the other one starts. So let's just go through. This lady, I said, I'm interested in knowing more about your fatigue. That's all I said. And she says, well, it's pretty much all the time. And then I was a busy person, but now it's different. I haven't felt like this before. Then she gives some examples. I feel good when I get up, but before I need a nap before my shower. I get nothing done. I'm a burden for my family. I try things, like in this case, she tried to go for a walk, but it wasn't long before her body actually refused to cooperate. I just couldn't make a proper step. So finally I sat down because I thought if I didn't, I'd fall over. Then she starts to give another example. My husband wanted to take me out for supper. So I rested. You can see that she's really trying to be sensible about this. And they drove and they had some soup, but she got so sleepy. And so he said, she should put her head down. She said, but I didn't want to. That would just look weird. I'd rather not go out if I have to start taking naps in restaurants. So I didn't, all I said was, look weird. So this is me, I as the interviewer. Well, you know, when was the last time? It's just not done, and so forth. So these are all, these are all what I would call codes. And the next step would be to group things that were common together. So there's some things about time, some things about it's really different. Here's some examples of how it's different. She can't do work, she has to have a nap. This is new. So you can see these codes start to come together. Here you have the theory that I built from this data. So basically, at the top, we have some psychological, physiological challenge. And the question is the person able to adapt to that challenge? Can they find order in the chaos they're experiencing? If not, anxiety goes up straight off. And we have people who have moderately high fatigue. So they're trying to make adaptations, changes, some success. They come down here. Now they're trying to create a transition to this new experience. If they're successful, they can carry on. If not, they experience overexertion or inertia. So energy stopping, energy depleting. So the lady in the previous example, the problem that she was having is that she could not realistically estimate how much energy she had. She was doing everything she could think of to try and save energy, slowing down, having naps, giving away work. But she couldn't find that point where her activity and her energy balanced. But I want to tell you about this group. This is a really funny group down here, the inertia group. We had a lady one time and we said, you know, you're on chemo, you're going to feel tired. You should start thinking about ways you could reorganize your day to save energy. Well, she was a hockey fan and she loved going to hockey games. She actually gave up her hockey tickets, though. And this was at a time, I don't know if you're a hockey fan, but the Edmonton Oilers were Stanley Cup winners at that stage. So she had tickets for the Oilers home games. Like, this is like gold, right? So people were more than happy to take those off her hands. But as her treatment progressed, she didn't feel a lot of fatigue. Her fatigue was low, but she said, you know, I could have gone to those hockey games. I think I feel good enough. I could have gone. But she didn't want to ask for them back. And I said, well, maybe you could watch it on TV. And she looked at me like, you're not a hockey fan, are you? And she's right there. I mean, I don't really understand hockey, but for a diehard hockey fan who had home seasons, home tickets to home games when the Oilers were winning Stanley Cups, you don't watch it on TV. So I've learned that although we can advise people about impending fatigue, you don't want them making too many changes too early. It has to be one of those things that gradually evolves over time that they're always paying attention to, so that they establish a new routine that works for them, and that they are constantly monitoring here and adjusting their routine as they need to. And when they do that, they actually generate energy and they have an improved quality of life. The people on the left-hand column, those pathways all lead to insufficient adaptation, reduced quality of life. And so you can start to see a downward spiral, people becoming increasingly more fatigued. So my research question for this study started out, why do some people with cancer have fatigue and some don't? If you read the literature when I first started, you think they all do, but I knew from watching in clinic that that's not true. Some did and some didn't. I checked hemoglobin levels, I checked weight loss, I checked other biological markers for inflammation. Didn't see much change except that white count was elevated. Most of these people were post-surgery, about 6 to 8 weeks post-surgery. So that's what got me thinking that maybe this was a social psychological process. And that's exactly what you see here on the right-hand side. So this is the adaptation that people went through. I had always hoped to build a nursing intervention that would incorporate these elements, but that's one thing that I didn't quite get to. I got fascinated by the biological processes, wanted to make sure I understood them first, so that we could target our interventions more carefully. So some practical problems associated with grounded theory. Sometimes the research question is unclear, and so the reason for using grounded theory is not readily apparent. We only use grounded theory if we have a research question related to process. Premature closure is all about not enough saturation. And what happens there then is the data are very thin and you can't progress to theory because you don't have enough data to support. Another problem is failure to analyze the data as they come in. This means that data collection takes way longer and you typically need more people if you wait to the end to analyze. We already talked about the problems you can get into if you use existing frameworks. And this last comment is partly related to the theory development. I think it's important to not go too fast. You might want to do 2 or 3 studies before you really start talking about what your theoretical base is. I have settled on stress theory. So I see fatigue as a marker for inability to adapt to stress. And so that means that I should be able to see fatigue in any situation where inability to adapt exists, physiologically, psychologically, socially, and that's indeed what we have found. So I've given you a bunch of references here that I found helpful. I hope you will too. And here's my final slide. It shows the upcoming master classes that ATLAS is sponsoring together with TQ, and also our upcoming conference called Thinking Qualitatively, which will be taking place here in Edmonton. And I wanted to just point out that the day after that conference, if you're interested, we have a full day training session with Dr. Bridget Smith from South Africa using ATLAS.ti software. So I think I'll stop talking now and would love to hear questions and comments.
Thank you very much. So everybody, anybody would like to ask a question? And in fact, we have our first question here. Can you come back to references? Mohammed is asking.
Yeah. Yeah. Here.
All right, so the references are there. Any questions about that? Anybody else would like to ask questions? If you do, you can either write them down or raise your hand.
Go ahead. this one right here, my colleagues and I, 2002, this is the full article that the diagram came from. So if you want to read the full article, that's where you will find it.
Thank you. I have a question from Jessica Nelson. Do you have any advice for a master's student just starting a project involving qualitative methods?
I would say which design?
Yeah, let me see if we can offer the microphone to Jessica. Jessica, may I offer you the microphone? I can open it for you from here. Let me try that, okay? Just a second here. Oh no, she cannot. She's in a lab now, so she cannot talk. So could you maybe follow up on what Dr. Olson just asked?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, it's very tempting to just say, I'm going to do a qualitative study and not specify a design. That's highly problematic because each design specifies data sources, analytic strategies. You know, it would be like saying, I think I'll do a quantitative study, a randomized control trial, but I don't feel like randomizing. You have to randomize. That's the essence of the design. So I think what you, as tempting as it is to not make your design explicit, that will only make your project more difficult for the end.
Thank you. Emma has a question. Emma, may I offer you the microphone? If you can talk, just say yes, and I will, you write that down and I will give it to you. Yes, okay, so Emma, I will give you the microphone. If you could start by introducing yourself. Okay, go ahead now, Emma.
Oh. Hello, my name is Emma Rose, and I'm a professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Thank you, Dr. Olson, for the webinar. It's been fascinating. I'm wondering if you can go a little bit deeper into your personal process with the example that you gave us from going from the concepts to actually building theory. I feel like there's just a really big step in there, and I'm wondering if you can just give us some insights into your own process.
Well, it took a long time, and it particularly took a long time because we had a big research team. But we needed to have nurses from all the different units that looked after these particular patients, and also from occupational therapy in our hospital. So I have become a big fan of gigantic whiteboards. And the way I like to do it is I'm, you know, Ricardo, you're going to smile because this was before the days of software.
Yeah.
But the way I used to do it in the old, and I mean, it's important to know how to do it on paper so that you can take the best advantage of the software. So what I used to do is I would write my codes, I would do all my coding on paper, and I would write my little codes on sticky notes, like Post-it notes. And then I would put them all up on the whiteboard. And then I'd make little groups of the ones that seemed similar. And on the back of the Post-it notes, I would have which interview and which line number that quote came from, so that if I needed to go back and check context, I could. So now I've got some groupings of codes. And remember, Glaser said, these are all indicators. So the question is, what is this an indicator of? And so it seemed to me that I remember one of the first inklings I had that I had something kind of different here was that I had a lot of data similar to what you saw in this interview where, I mean, people are busy people. You're all busy. You know what Fridays are like. But by Monday, we're pretty good again. You know, we have a couple of days off and we feel fine. But the people said, I'm not fine on Monday. In fact, I could be worse. So now I've got two different things. In the literature on fatigue, they called that acute and chronic fatigue. But I thought, you know, this isn't chronic. Chronic is something that's 6 months or more, at least as I understand it. So what have I got here? I've got two different things. Then as I started, branching out and studying fatigue in different conditions. So chronic fatigue syndrome, depression, shift workers, athletes. And the people with chronic fatigue syndrome were the most informative because they talked about something after fatigue. They said, oh, if it were only just fatigue, I'd be fine. But they went to a very profound state where, like, one lady had been a designer, interior decorator, and she could look at a chair and tell you how much it would cost to recover that chair in this fabric or this fabric, and she would just do it in her head. Well, she got to the grocery store, and the person told her how much money she had to pay, and she couldn't figure out what she should take out of her wallet to make that amount of money. And then she had walked to the store, but she couldn't remember the way home. So the store had to call her husband to come and pick her up. Can you imagine? So that said to me that I've got something after fatigue. So I started to have these three categories: tiredness, fatigue, and exhaustion. And in the diagram, like, that was a diagram from kind of early on, but it really talked about how fatigue developed. And in some of my later work, I have a paper called A New Way of Thinking About Fatigue. I kind of spell out the full-blown tiredness, fatigue, exhaustion model. But the reason the chronic fatigue syndrome people could talk about exhaustion is they would go down, tiredness, fatigue, exhaustion, and they would come back up to fatigue, and then they would stay with fatigue. Very few actually recovered from fatigue. With cancer patients, once they get to the exhaustion level, they're often moving into the palliative phase of the disease. So I do have some data in my cancer nursing paper, I think, where I really wanted to interview those advanced patients, and I did get some data from them, but I ended up using what we call shadowed data. So if you look up Morse on shadowed data, this is data where you ask the people who know the patient, so family members or their nurse, to talk about their observations of the patient. They're not talking about their own experience. This is useful for people who can't talk about their experience. It might be a child. But keep in mind, of course, that when you talk about your observations, it's not the same. So then as we build up these concepts and we have more and more data about how they go to, I started to make diagrams. Which ones come first? Which ones come next? How are they the same? How are they different? So there was, diagrams all over my whiteboards and the ones in the adjacent rooms as we tried to map out on paper how these emerging concepts went together. And furthermore, from Glaser's work, we were trying to figure out what are the phases within each of these concepts. We wanted to be, it's a process, right? So we have to show how you get from one to the next. And so I think in our diagram, you can see, the people who did well, they didn't do well right off the top. They actually went through a process of developing a management strategy for their fatigue. So it seems to be holding up, as periodically I'm actually asked to comment on advanced cases of fatigue, and I use that model I showed you to try and figure out where people are at, like what the problem is, so that we can tailor some interventions for them.
Okay, may I read out loud another question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so let me see here. Joseph is asking, Where do theoretical frameworks fit within grounded theory? Heading into comms, a heavy focus is on theory. If I want to use grounded theory as a design, what do I suggest? What do I suggest is my theoretical framework?
You can't have a theoretical framework at the beginning. In grounded theory, the framework emerges from the data. So you discuss it in the discussion section of your findings. So I didn't start out to see if fatigue was a marker for stress, inability to adapt to stress. My realization that that's what I was doing didn't surface until I'd done a few studies. So what will you talk about then in your comms? I would say you should talk about the theoretical underpinnings of grounded theory itself. That would be pragmatism, symbolic interactionism, and constructivism. And maybe kind of postmodern theory too, if you wanted to draw in Clark.
Another question that we have here is from Rebecca, and she said, I sometimes struggle to reach saturation and have become a little skeptical of the concept. Are my research questions maybe too broad?
Yes, I have, if it's any consolation, I have one study that I have not been able to saturate. It was a study about ovarian cancer, and I wanted to understand the process that people go, the problem, in ovarian cancer is that people surface very late in the disease process, and so the natural history is poor. And I was interested to see if we could pick up on some of the signs of ovarian cancer earlier and teach those to women so that people were aware of them, and maybe that would help. So, but the problem is that because the natural history is so short, I had difficulty getting back to people in time for a second or third interview. They were too sick now, so they couldn't really talk to me. And I don't know if I'll ever finish that study, but saturation is hard. And I think your idea of limiting the research question a little bit more might help. But another option would be to change your design. So if you look at something like interpretive description, Sally Thorne is really clear that saturation doesn't really apply. You just collect enough data until you're pretty sure you have a good description of the event or of the experience. And then the way my students do, what my students do next with that is they look at that description in light of various nursing theories to try and come up with some nursing interventions that might be helpful. So it could be that the design, grounded theory as a design, is not well suited to the question that you have.
Okay. May I go to the next question?
Yes.
Yeah, we only have about 5 minutes left, so let me see here. I am a PhD student, Samar is saying, conducting grounded theory to explore transgenerational trauma in Arab refugee children. I find difficulty in writing my literature review. I am not sure whether I am preconceptualizing my theory before gathering data, the actual process.
Yeah. So it would help me to know a little bit more. I understand intergenerational trauma. Of course, in Canada, we have lots of examples of that in the residential school issues. So the question, though, is tricky. Like you've given me a topic there, but I don't see the research question. Is the question something about parenting of young children, or is it about, so you need to have a question that's related to a process. Your question, just as Ricardo read it out now, sounds more like an ethnographic study to me. Because in ethnography, you're looking at the implicit beliefs and values that shape behavior. And the job of the ethnographer is to make those implicit beliefs and values clearer. So in interactions like this, it's really hard to say, but it sounds to me like you've got an ethnographic study on your hands, not a grounded theory study.
Well, what I could say to everybody, because we have a very long list of questions really, but we will not be able to answer them all. What I could say to all of you, Dr. Olson, if it's okay with you, that people can follow up with you by email. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay,
Or
so
you could just send, would it work for you to just send me the questions, Ricardo?
oh, I can send you the questions as well. I can create a report at the end. And we have come very close to the end. We only have 3 more minutes, so that is enough for me to ask Julianna to say a few words before we close.
Thank you so much, Karin and Ricardo. I will follow up with just a few notes on this last slide as well on behalf of IIQM. Again, our Think Qualitatively conference is upcoming. The registration and abstract submission site is open. The call for abstract submissions, you have until just March 15th to get those submissions in to be considered. So I'd encourage those of you who are interested, please visit our site as listed there and consider submitting an abstract. As well, we with all of our archives in our webinar series, where possible, we also upload the PDF. So those of you who were looking for those references, after the webinar link for video is up, we'll be putting up the link to this PowerPoint as well, which will have those references for you. And potentially, depending on Karin's approach here, we may be able to put a PDF up with answers of your questions as well. So that's a possibility. We'll see if we get there on that. So thank you again, both of you, for what was a really great talk. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much, Julianna. And let me add that I sent to all of you the link to the IIQM website page where you can access the slides as well as the video of the presentation. And I suppose, Julianna, this will be there maybe next week.
So the slides I'll have available later today, and
Okay.
as soon as the video link has been sent by yourself, I'll be able to add that as well.
Okay, thank you. And just to tell everybody that we are now going into our 7th season, 7th year of this very successful webinar series. And the success of this series is possible because of your participation. People from all over the world have been coming to this presentation since 2013. And we thank you for that. And we hope to have you again in the future. And of course, it's always a good idea to share this with students so that they can either attend to new webinars, but also go to the archived list of webinars and watch some of those there. You know, there are some very, very interesting and from very well-known qualitative researchers. So thank you all of you for your continued support of this series. And Dr. Olson, any final words before we close?
No, just thanks for the opportunity. I always enjoy meeting people in this way, and I look forward to getting the questions and ongoing dialogue with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time. When will next time be, Julianna? Do we have a calendar already?
We do, and as is noted there, we have an upcoming webinar on March 19th with Bukola Salami on community-based participatory action research. So we look forward to seeing you then.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye from Corvallis, Oregon. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.